Hi there, and welcome along to the On the Whistle podcast. I'm your host, Zayn Nabbi, and joining me today to talk about the CAF Champions League final is our star-studded lineup. If we were a front three, we would not be Messi, we would not be Mbappe, and we would not be Neymar. We'd be Nabbi, Mezahi, and Howorth. Maher Mezahi, North African football expert. Welcome to the show. How are you doing, my good man?
Yeah, I'm doing very well. It's we've made it through another season, another long African football season. We only have these upcoming qualifiers to go, and then we can finally have a month or two off. So looking forward to it.
Amazing, amazing. A man who never ever has a day or minute off on this podcast is Alasdair Howorth. Alasdair, always good to see your young smile. You fill me with such energy with your youthful exuberance. How have you been conquering the world?
Zayn, let me tell you, I don't get a moment's rest when I've got my kind of taskmaster, Zayn Nabbi, pushing me every single day, making me do this, that, and the other. But I'm doing well. As Maher said, looking forward to a little bit of rest. Although for me, covering a lot of women's football as well, the fun just gets started with the World Cup. Football never rests, man. Like these guys never give us a break, do they?
No, and they shouldn't. And they shouldn't, right? And listen, for those of you listening out there, we want you to join Africa's biggest football braai. You can find us at OTW_podcast. Send us your comments, send us your questions, send us your emoji love. We love to hear from you. And today we get to celebrate what was a memorable two-legged final in the CAF Champions League. We had the incredible Ahly win their 11th continental title. They are the kings of Africa. They are, as we know, they own North Africa as much as the other countries, the Algerians, the Tunisians, the Moroccans, don't want to know this Egyptian club, have conquered again. The two-legged final, Al Ahly beating Wydad, the winners from last year, 3-2 on aggregate after a 1-1 draw in Casablanca. It was an incredible game. It was incredible excitement, particularly for the fans. And Meher, I remember ahead of the first leg, I'm going to rewind a little bit. I saw on the Twitters you were saying that you actually like the fact that there's a two-legged final and not one showpiece event in a neutral venue or at one home ground. I thought you had articulated that well, really, Bell, and without stealing your thunder, why is it that you do like the two-legged affair?
Well, I mean, unlike European football, which has moved to or has been at a one-legged final now for a very long time, for decades, and also scrapped the away goals rule just a few years ago. In Africa, we still obviously have held on to both of those. And I think it's been the right decision for a few different reasons. Number one, playing away in Africa is very, very hard. I mean, the travel is difficult. Usually you don't fly direct. You're stopping sometimes in Istanbul, sometimes in Paris, and taking, sometimes commercial flights to these matches. And then the atmospheres that are generated in some of these stadiums are infernal. The intimidation goes way past the pitch. Yanga were complaining about USM of Algiers supporters lighting fireworks and flares outside of their hotel so they couldn't go to sleep. There's flares, there's lasers. So I think you really have to reward the away team for putting in good performances and scoring goals away from home. So I think the logic of it still applies. Whereas if you're in Europe and you're playing, I don't know, for me, it doesn't really matter if you're playing in Benfica, if you're playing, I don't know, in Barcelona. It's pretty much the same thing. It's the same process. Yeah, some places are marginally louder than others, but we've gotten to a point in European football where it's very uniform. And I still don't think that's the case in African football.
Well, you've hit on something that was a fantastic advertisement for the African game. That was the crowd in Casa. And also the week before, it was the crowd in Cairo in terms of the color and the fandom and the tifos. Do you think that the fans and the way that they got involved in the game was just the right pictures and images we needed to get the right publicity out around this final?
Yeah, and if you understand the nuances of it all, it's even more meaningful. So Al Ahly, this was only the second time that they had this amount of supporters in Cairo International Stadium. So in previous years, they had played home matches, but they were playing in Burj Al Arab. They were not playing at home, which is the Cairo International Stadium. So the first time was actually earlier in this Champions League campaign when they played against Al Hilal. That meant a lot to Al Ahly supporters. It felt like a time before the Egyptian Revolution where there were no attendance caps, there were no limits, and Al Ahly were the cream of the crop, really. And after the Egyptian Revolution, they had a few years where they really suffered. So this is the second of two amazing spells in Ahly club history. The first was between 2005 and 2009 when they made 4 consecutive finals. They won 3 of those.
Mm-hmm.
This year, they've also made 4 consecutive finals, and now they've won 3 of them as well. So Al Ahly, that was great to see. And my goodness, Casablanca. I was there last year, not this year. I was there last year for the one-legged final. And I really think that was the craziest atmosphere I've ever been to. Those Wydad supporters, usually you have, a section behind the stands that's very rowdy and synchronized. But at that Mohammed V Stadium, you get the whole bowl, the entire 60,000 chanting and singing in unison. And that's what really makes it another level.
Well, we spoke about the clouds, certainly 5-star performances. Ali, I have to say the actual football was pretty low on quality. Set pieces deciding the final. I mean, from that perspective, some time wasting also. How did you see it?
I mean, it was certainly an advertisement of African football in some of the best and kind of maybe more controversial ways because, over these 2 legs, and again, I think, to go off Maher's point, I think it's another reason why the 2-legged final is really good because we saw the week before, or last weekend as well, is the UEFA Champions League final, 1 leg. The last 4 seasons, it's all been 1-0, all cagey, tight affairs, not much going on. Whereas when you have the 2 legs, you have 90 minutes where one team, the onus is on them to attack, the onus is on them. And we saw that in the first leg where Al Ahly did pull off, again, not an incredible game overall, but some of the, the goals, El Shahat's talent in terms of finding Percy Tau, some brilliant football in there. But in the second leg, it was anything but. It was attritional. It was time wasting. It was kind of everything that you come to expect from a massive North African
quintessential,
match.
North African derby. Perfect.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Because I have to ask
Absolutely.
both you guys this question, right? You had Percy Tau, who's arguably been the player of the tournament. You had Al Shahat, who's also been incredible this tournament, and particularly brilliant in the first leg. Why was it that they weren't able to hit their stride in the second leg? Or am I not giving Wydad enough credit with how they were breaking down the attack?
Well, I think, you're right to point out those 2 players. I think they were the best players, along with the center half, Mohamed Abdel Mun'im, throughout Al Ahly's campaign, really. But the way that these North African derbies are played, especially after Wydad got their goal, they're going to try to slow down the rhythm as much as possible. It seemed like every sequence of play is punctuated by, either players arguing with the referee, somebody feigning an injury, a cynical foul. That's the way that, these North African teams play. They intend to break the rhythm. And when they do that, they can frustrate you. And we even saw a lot of frustration from the Al Ahly players, snapping at some of the players, getting reactionary yellow cards. It really was working. And I thought there's no way that Al Ahly is going to come back into this until they scored very late in the match. Sorry for the spoiler alert. But I thought that kind of match doesn't really suit the style of play of Percy Tau or Hussein and Shahat. So that's why I think they were less effective.
Well, I hate to talk about the man in the middle, but it was Bamlak Tessema's last game.
Allegedly, reportedly. Some Ethiopians are saying maybe not.
His comeback tour is still on.
Well, I'd like him to have a comeback tour because he certainly had a mixed final. Ali, what did you make of the performance out there? There were some interesting decisions.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there was some, I would say, frankly, terrible decisions in terms of not sending off El Shahat for when he got, physically pulled back by him. And then also kind of then in the second half when it was it Mohamed Hani or
Mohamed Hani
who got two yellow cards and didn't get sent off, which again feels crazy, but I think it's really easy, and we love to do this. Same with Jenny Sikazwe in AFCON to just put all the blame on the referees. But kind of the reality is we have a massive problem in football with the way we treat referees, the way we approach, the way they're taught, and I think we see that in every facet of football, whether it's talking about VAR, whether it's talking about referees, in this space, in a massive North African derby. The reality is Tessema shouldn't have to be the one telling these players to not be pushing him. He should have the authority to send them off because there's a precedent of players who, when they disrespect the referee, when they get in his face, when they, cross that line, they get punished. But the reality is in football, you let that line be pushed to the point where now you can be intimidated. And particularly, I cannot imagine the emotional stress. We think about the players. Imagine being a referee in that environment in Casablanca or in that environment in Cairo, giving a decision against the home fans, giving a decision, against anyone, that the amount of tension that is in that game. And I think that is a huge problem. Yes, Tessema did not have a great game. I hope it's not his last game, because I think he has a lot more to offer, because I do think he's one of our better referees. But I think in a lot of ways, this was just another example of how referees have been let down. We saw the same in Europe, where in the Premier League, the referee ended up elbowing was Andy Robertson, and it's that environment where referees make poor decisions when they're in an environment where they don't have support, where they're under constant pressure. So I think, yes, he had a really bad game. Fortunately, it didn't there wasn't any calls in terms of penalty decisions or anything like that visibly cost Wydad the game, although I guess the red card would have changed the game. But I think it makes us really need to have a conversation in a wider sense of why are referees not getting the protection they need? Because we hear it week in, week out. Ex-referee has been attacked. This is a game where he was refereeing against Wydad, who's in attendance, Fawzi Lekja, who, allegedly headbutted him. The very same referee. What was it, 3-4 years ago? So and this is when he was the president of Barkhan, but that's a club president headbutting, allegedly, a referee. That cannot be allowed to happen, and for that environment to be created. So I think we need to take a long, hard look at ourselves.
And I empathize with him because Hussein had tugged on his shirt. I think it was the 26th minute or around the 30th minute. If he sends him off right there, that's the story of the match. It's, I can't believe he ruined the final. 30 minutes in, we didn't even get to play, and he's killed it. We're down to 10 men, So I empathize with him in that he doesn't want to make himself the story. Good referee is a referee. You don't realize, you don't notice, you don't pay attention to. And I empathize with him there. And even I think 10 minutes after that, Sambu, the Senegalese striker from Wydad, also put his hands on him. It wasn't very physical, but he put his hands on Bamlak as well. And then in the second half, Bamlak got in a few players' faces. So it's one of those where it just became the style of officiating. I mean, in that match, he sort of fought fire with fire. And I think overall, under those circumstances, he probably made the right decision not to send off Shahat. I know by the letter of the law, it's not the right decision, but I think he navigated it well so that we could at least have a final. Now, if you want to crack down on it, send a point of emphasis to all the clubs. Say, look, this will absolutely not be tolerated this season. Before the match, speak to both captains. Look, anybody touches me, they're getting a straight sending off. But at least he salvaged that final in that sense.
Yeah, and that's the point. I think there needs to be that precedent set at the beginning of a season, and we see the same thing across Europe, across Africa, across Asia, What needs to happen is at the beginning of the season, there needs to be, a memo sent out to every club, every federation saying, these are the new standards. If you cross them, you will not get away with it, and immediately implement it. Because like you said, he can't suddenly become a stricter ref just because it's a final and it's an intense situation. He has to manage it in the way in which he's been put in a situation to manage it. And I think, like you said, given circumstances, he's not done as bad a job as I think we would be led to believe by kind of just the surface of it.
Now, I can't help but look at this tournament and put my South African cap on for a minute. Because, that's where the bias lives. We have to weave ourselves in to everything. Because if we're like Americans and we're like English, if we're not in the narrative, it's not interesting. But
Zayn, sorry, are you accused of being a Pirates, a Chiefs, a Sundowns fan? What do people think you are?
Okay, I'm going to make the sign and let's see if you can get it.
Okay, Pirates.
What I will say is based
on... No. Do you know
I don't know this one. I thought this is Pirates. Okay,
Pirates.
What's this?
That's the Pirates, so that's Pirates, right? I'm Abafana Bestende, the Backhill Boys.
I don't know them. Okay, Golden Arrows. Okay.
You won't. We are like Sundowns were nicknamed the Brazilians, but we try play like Brazilians. Okay. You'll know a coach who coached there once upon a time. It was the man who was one of the assistants at Sundowns. It is not. Do you know who it is? Do you know who the coach is? I'm testing you here, because it's great. Mankoba Manita.
Yeah, so he was the one that was co-coach with Mokwena,
yeah? Yeah. And he used to coach at Golden Arrows when I used to cover local football Wow, over a decade ago. And they played a really good brand of football and they won what would be the equivalent of the League Cup. And they were the only team in my city that were there. Prior to that, I was a Manning Rangers fan, which you would have no interest in, but Courtney, who's on this pod, they won the inaugural Premier Soccer League in South Africa.
Got it.
And they did a Leicester before Leicester even did it, and then they went bankrupt.
Not putting any omens on Leicester.
They're already down.
Let's see
They're
if
already
they come
down.
Yeah,
back.
exactly.
But I have to ask you, I have to take you back to a point in the football season where Sundowns are flying high, they're looking excellent. Ronwen Williams saves a penalty against Al Hilal. Al Hilal win, they qualify, and Al Ahly are knocked out. Lawrence Collar came on the pod, was doing a review, and said, "Watch this be the moment that Sundowns regret, and Al Ahly go and win the tournament." His words, no word of a lie, have come to fruition. But when you look back, Ronwen Williams save, I mean, should they have played it another way?
Egyptian
Could they
fans have
played
been
it another way?
joking that they should sign Ronwen Williams or the Al Hilal defender Atara Tahir, who missed that penalty, who had it saved, to an honorary contract of sorts, and compensate them for that, because that was the turning point really for Al Ahly. And to be fair to Al Ahly, I mean, they had a hectic start of the Champions League campaign because of the congestion and fixtures. They were at the Club World Cup, and one of the things that I think this coach Marcel Koller has done a really good job of is they seem to bounce back very well. Whenever they get behind, these rough patches of 2-3 matches, they bounce back really strongly, and they did that time and time and time again. And now they've won 4 trophies this season, and they're going to win the Premier League in probably a matter of weeks. So just Al Ahly being Al Ahly, really so great, and that is the difference at times. At the very highest level, it's a game of very fine margins.
And bear in mind the congestion. They have 6 games in hand in the Egyptian Premier League.
Yep.
So a cursory glance at the table, and you're like, oh, they're in second. Maybe things aren't going that well, and then you realize, oh, they're only 2 points behind Pyramids, but they have 6 games in hand. I mean, the schedule for them has been absolutely ridiculous. I mean, we saw El Shanawi as well on the point about Williams taking off his medal and giving it to Schubert, who had to play in the first leg, who didn't qualify for a medal because I don't think he had enough game time, and he wasn't in the match day squad in the second leg. They need to mail that medal to Ronwen, man. He did just as much.
Ronwen, who's come on the spot when he was captain of Supersport, so a friend of the show. Ronwen, we know you have to do your job, and you did a great job saving the penalty, so please take that in good humor. I have to ask you, Maher, we talk about the Club World Cup. We know that in Europe, people might not take it as seriously as other parts of the world. We know the South Americans always take it seriously. We know in Africa, we see that as a great shop window, and similarly with Asia. I have to ask you, Al Ahly have performed amazingly at this tournament in the past. What are your expectations going into the tournament? I mean, could this team hold the amazing Manchester City to a draw, or could they, keep the score low if they ever got them in a semi? Or am I even asking a question that's fair?
I mean, Manchester City's so good, right? They're so good. That's the problem,
Come on,
Inter
they didn't roll over Inter.
So look, the best African result in the Club World Cup was finalist. It was Wydad Casablanca in 2013, 10 years ago now.
And TP
Mazembe as well. Raja were at home when they did it, so they had home support behind them. Look, can Al Ahly do it? I have questions about what their squad is going to look like in December. So they've already had one midfielder poached by a Qatari club, Hamdi Fathi. He just signed today, I believe, to Al Wakra, I want to say, in Qatar. And I wonder, is Mohammed Abdul Mun'im going to be poached? That their star defender. What about Hussein Al Shahat? Because what's happening right now in the Gulf, in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, is you have a spending spree. You have a blitz. You have money being spent everywhere, and one of the favorite targets is North Africa. It's one of the best markets for those leagues. So if they can resist, if they can keep their squad, they probably need a striker. They've been playing Kahraba as a number 9. He's more of a natural winger. If they can get a proper striker, hold on to most of their players, I think they can go pretty far. It's going to be in Saudi Arabia. They're going to have a lot of home support. If not, I have my doubts. And Manchester City, I think, is going to, if they can continue in the form that they're in, I think they're going to run over everyone.
Well, I will say, I mean, I was at the Club World Cup this year in Morocco, and watching Al Ahly go up against Real Madrid. Obviously, I don't think Real Madrid are quite as good as Man City as we've seen, but in many ways they went toe to toe with Real Madrid. El Shahat again had an absolute stormer. He made Camavinga look, I don't even know, like a U16 defender, and he turned him inside out repeatedly, even moving onto that right wing to target him. So I would say, they have it in them in terms of trying to go toe to toe with these big teams. I think what we saw in that game, particularly, was a bit of a naivety, and in the way in which and I even felt this in the game against Wydad, is it felt like sometimes Al Ahly doesn't know how to be the small team. They don't understand that sometimes they're the team that has to defend, go on the break, and I felt that in that first half against Wydad. Wydad didn't create much. There wasn't much kind of clinical football in the final third, but they got through Al Ahly's midfield press time and time again. And, we saw, moments before they scored that free kick to take the lead, they had a free kick in the exact same position that Atiat Alaz, that time his cross kind of went straight into El Shanawi. But time and time again, Al Ahly just didn't know how to defend deep, didn't know how to keep their shape. And that's the sense that I got. And I totally get that. There's arguably no other team in world football that is expected to dominate in the way that Al Ahly are expected to. They are the favorites for every single Egyptian Premier League, every single CAF Champions League. So to suddenly go from that and jump into a one-off fixture against, a Flamengo, a Palmeiras, a Man City, like suddenly you have to learn how to be the small team, and that is an incredibly difficult.
But that is the target. They realize that they're the club of the century. Last century, they're probably going to be this century's club of the century as well. The target is become the first African club to win the Club World Cup. That's definitely in the minds of all the players, all the supporters, all the administrators. It is a real target for Al Ahly.
And can I also just make a brief side point? Maher's talking about Saudi football. I was about to message our group saying, what we need? We need a podcast talking about Saudi football, the PIF's investment, how it impacts Africa, but more specifically how it impacts, our friend of the show, Pitso Mosimane. And then what do I see? The news today is Pitso has left Al Ahly, despite not being paid his wages for the last 4 months. One of the clubs that are getting the investment from PIF. Read into that what you will, but a black coach who's done so well wherever he's gone goes to Al Ahly whilst they're in seventh, turns them around, takes them to first, gets promoted, and then suddenly millions and millions is pumped into Al Ahly. They're on the verge of potentially signing Mahrez, and then Pitso Mosimane is suddenly pushed out the back door. Read into that what you will, but I'm not very happy.
And we shouldn't be. Gentlemen, I have to ask you, as we'll leave the pod on a positive note. 3 titles in 4 years, one of the losses being a controversial one to Wydad last year. Is this the greatest African club team ever assembled? Hot Mike.
This 11, you mean this squad?
Let's talk about the dynasty. Let's talk about it over the last 4 years, because the squad has changed.
It's either this one or the one from 2005 to 2009 with Manuel Jose as a coach. I think that one was a little bit stronger. When you look at some of the names, Mohamed Abu Trika, Ahmed Met'ab, Wael Gum'a, Isam Al Hadari, those were that's the crux of the Egyptian national team that went on to three-peat in the Africa Cup of Nations. So I do think that side was a little bit stronger. They had a little bit more cohesion as well. They were more representative of that Egyptian golden generation, whereas this year's iteration, you have very important foreign players like Ali Ma'loud, like Percy Tau, like Aliou Dieng as well. So I do think that 2005 to 2009 side was slightly better, but I think not a lot of justice is given to this current iteration of Al Ahly. They're very, very good, and what they've done is historic, absolutely historic. 3 Champions Leagues in 4 years is not easy to do. I know it's the second time their club have done it, but other than that, it's very, very rare for that to happen throughout the history of this competition. And the manner in which they've been able to do it in the political context that the country's in, where they can't really rely on their home support that much, they're not generating the atmospheres that they're playing for in empty stadiums, whereas opposed to in 2005 to 2009, they had, the Cairo International Stadium was full every single time. So they deserve more credit than they've been given. I think we should start mentioning them in this conversation, but I do think that 2005, 2009 was slightly better.
Hard for me to disagree with that. Ali?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would say is there probably isn't quite as much competition as well. I think the last few years there hasn't been as, some of the strong teams that we've seen over the last decades haven't been there. I think like TP Mazembe, where have they been? Mid 2000s, even a team like Enyimba, nowhere to be seen now. And some of the other sides like Esperance, some of the Algerian clubs aren't at the same level as I would say Wydad. Wydad, Al-Ahly, and even Sundowns. And I would even say that, like this season, I don't think it's any secret that Wydad aren't nearly as strong as they were last season. But I think, yeah, given the kind of context of them not having home support for much of this time, but as well as, you think about what was the one season that they didn't win the Champions League? It was last season when they were effectively forced to play a one-legged away match. And, we know the statistics around African teams in away matches and in Champions League finals. The win rate is astronomically low. And so I think, that even that one loss has a massive caveat. And kind of like Maher was saying, I don't think this is nearly as an iconic team, but I also think a lot of that isn't Al Ahly's fault. I think the reason why that Al Ahly team in the mid 2000s and late 2000s was so iconic was because that Egyptian team was so iconic as well. And you had the superstars of Abu Trika and these guys kind of come plying their trade there. So I think that's another thing. And I think this Al Ahly team is really interesting because you have a lot of exciting players. They still have the same retention of some of Egypt's best players. We think about Abdelmonem. If he played for any other club on the continent, he wouldn't be on this continent anymore. He would be in Europe. But Al Ahly still has that pulling power. But now they're drawing, South Africa's best, Tunisia's best. If Aliou Dieng ever actually gets a run in the Malian team, maybe Mali's best. Like they're drawing from a much wider pool than I think in previous years. But yeah, I think it is hard to top that Al Ahly team of the Naughties.
And sometimes we do neglect, some of those sides that we see in the 60s, 70s, 80s. We think they couldn't possibly be as good. But man, Hafia FC in the 70s with Papa Kamara, they had like so many great players. And that Guinea national team, it was similar to Al Ahly with Egypt, whereas the Hafia was pretty much Guinea's national team, and Guinea were finalists in 1972 at the AFCON, and they won three consecutive, I believe, Champions Leagues, or I know they won three, but I believe it was consecutive as well. That was a great team. You had some great Kotoko teams as well. And Yemba, as Alasdair mentioned, at the turn of the century. So there have been a lot of great teams that I would probably put ahead of this current iteration of Al Ahly. But I think the 2005-2009 Al Ahly was the greatest team ever. And I think this year they don't get enough credit they should get more credit. We should be having these conversations more.
Wonderful. Maher, Alasdair, it's been fantastic sitting around the braai with you. We could keep going. We could throw more coal in. We could throw more meat in. But we do have to make this a wrap. For those listening out there, please hit us up at our social media accounts, OTW_podcast, on Twitter and Instagram. And if you've come this far, leave a rating, leave a review. It helps people find the show. Maher, thank you for chewing the fat this week. Alasdair, always a pleasure seeing you. And we can't wait to do this again soon.